Here we are. Welcome to a special Dia de los Muertos edition of our live talk with curators. My name is Joy Davis, the manager of Adult and Community Programs here at the Walters Art Museum. Our program today and this evening is entitled How We Mourn, Death Practices Across the Collection. You can find more programming, art activities, and our wonderful community altar over at thewalters.org. Joining me today, there are three wonderfully gifted curators. I just want to say welcome to them as well. I will have them introduce themselves, their collection area, and specific cultures and time periods they will be focusing on today. And we're going to start with Ellen Hubler. Ellen?
Hi, Joy. So excited to be here with you today. My name is Ellen Hubler, and as you can see below, I'm the William B. Ziff Jr. Associate Curator of Art of the Americas here at the Walters. So my collection covers really quite a bit of breadth, both in terms of time period as well as geography. But today I'm going to be really focusing on death practices among the Aztecs. So I think one thing that's going to be really interesting that'll come out over this evening is that the Aztecs are kind of unusual in that where you go after death doesn't depend on how virtuous or non-virtuous you are during your life, but rather has to do with your method of death. So there was Mictlan, the sort of general underworld, which had 9 levels to it. And most people would go to Mictlan. Most people who died of old age, just in general, would go to Mictlan and start a 4-year journey to get to the deepest 9th level of Mictlan. So you'd need some offerings and maybe even a dog to help to be sacrificed, I hate to say, to help you make the journey in Mictlan. But people who had died in more virtuous ways or more ways that were exceptional would actually ascend up and go to other places. So sort of the most highly prestigious deaths were warriors who had died in battle, and also conversely women who had died in childbirth, who were thought to be the equivalent of warriors. Those people were known as companions of the eagle, and they went up to accompany the sun on its passage across the sky. People who died in accidents or in anything that had to do with water, which is to say drowning, lightning strikes, and certain diseases that were thought to be associated with water, went to Tlalocan, the watery paradise, which was this beautiful place of abundance and peace and eternal springtime. And then babies were thought to almost get a do-over. They would go to a special heaven near Tlalocan where milk just dripped off of the trees into to help feed them, and they would go back on Earth and sort of get a second chance at things.
That's wonderful. I figure we could transition to you, Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Anderson-Zhu. I am the Associate Curator of Art of the Ancient Mediterranean, which covers vast cultures and time periods, basically from 5000 BCE up until the Christian period. So many of these cultures and their ideas about death and how to commemorate spirits and how spirits live on, they're quite complicated. So mostly I'll be giving you some little vignettes about things that have come up as we've discussed this that really sort of vibe with the idea of Day of the Dead and commemoration. But there were sort of in general in the Mediterranean world, there was this concept that there was an afterlife and that the individual did live on in some way. And that there needed to be some interaction between the living and the dead, specifically that the dead would need offerings and attention from the living, and the living would go to certain places and often at certain times of day. Sort of vibing off what Ellen was talking about with the afterlife, there are so many different conceptions and ideas of the afterlife in the Mediterranean world. In the Egyptian world, there was the duat and the field of reeds. or something that was more positive versus negative, and there was quite a journey, and you would need spells and a map to sort of get you there properly. In the Greco-Roman world, there were many different conceptions, whether it was positive or negative. Hades, Elysium, there was also a conception of Tartarus, where certain people would be punished. So, and then there's also the mystery cults, and it's actually quite difficult to say what they believe because it's a mystery. So as we go through, we'll talk a little bit more about aspects of that.
And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Jo.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jo Briggs, and I'm the Jenny Waters Delano Associate Curator of 18th and 19th Century Art. And my job's maybe a little bit easier than Lisa's because I'm talking about Europe and the United States in the 1800s. And broadly speaking, these are Christian beliefs, and I'm aware there is a lot more diversity at this time, but the artwork in our collection really reflects a sort of Christian mindset. And there was a belief, again, broadly speaking, that when you die, your soul, which is eternal, either goes to heaven or it goes to hell. And hopefully you and your friends and relations are going to go to heaven. So death was actually seen as something of a departure from suffering and going on to bliss and peaceful rest. And I'd say in the 19th century, there's almost what I would call a sentimental relationship to death for those reasons. And I think the Victorians generally are quite associated with death and mourning. And I think we'll get into that a little bit later, but Queen Victoria was really the person who kind of epitomizes this. So when her husband died, Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria went into mourning and wore black for the whole of the rest of her life. And that was actually 40 years, so a pretty long time. But I think the idea of this kind of black dressed widow still kind of is prevalent in films or in fiction or even in sort of fashion at this time.
Thank you all for your really wonderful intros to your work and how it relates, to the theme of how we mourn. As you know, from hearing from the curators, we will be discussing a wide range of cultures across very large periods of time. One thing that's really important to understand about how we mourn is that it is connected to who we are, where we are, and also often the time of year. So time comes into play quite a bit. So much of that is our culture or a culture. Culture is certainly not stagnant, and we often, but often changes or moves we thought were important to touch on major concepts in this talk, and to kind of codify, to solidify that, we'll start with syncretism. And so syncretism is a term used to describe the coming together of culture practices or cultural practices that may from the outside seem disconnected. It's where all cultures have, really we can speak to, most cultures have syncretic practices. So, a lot of us will be participating this weekend in Halloween in some form of fashion, whether that's just watching a series of horror films, participating in trick or treat, and there are so many other activities that are traditional in America for Halloween, and that, of course, is a syncretic tradition here in the States. And we can start with our first slide. Thank you. So Halloween is also known as All Hallows Eve, which begins in Triduum. It is included in All Hallows Eve, also known as All Saints' Day, which resides on November 1st. This is also followed by All Souls Dia, which is also, or All Souls Day, which is our festival is named after, Dia de los Muertos. So you'll hear about these cultural practices today, this evening, and some of them may sound familiar to you, even if they aren't necessarily from an area or time period you're familiar with. And we would love for you to share your observations, your reflections, and your questions throughout the talk in our chat boxes, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. So I'm excited to dive into this journey with everybody here, and we're going to talk about two themes in particular today. It's going to be time and place. So I figured we would start with Lisa. We can have our next slide. And this is my question for you, Lisa. How does time help us understand mourning in your collection area?
In many cases, in many ways, what I find most interesting with the idea of commemoration of the dead and set times for commemoration is how they differ from what we're used to, particularly that as I was looking into this, it was more emphasizing the period of spring and renewal and flowers. Like there's really an emphasis on the time when the dead can come back is the time of renewal as well. So what I'm showing here is my favorite artwork at the Walters Art Museum. Biased, it is the best artwork at the Walters Art Museum. The sarcophagus with the Triumph of Dionysus from the 2nd century CE, which is filled with life. Showing the wine god and his entourage. And there's all these scenes on it showing life. There's even a nest with eggs, bird's eggs, so birth. So while Dionysus himself doesn't have anything to do with the times that we know of that there was this interaction with the dead, what we do know best is the Roman periods when there was interaction with the dead. So I've listed a few here, but what I find just fascinating, they're all basically related to interacting with your dead ancestors. The main time to interact in the Roman period was the Parentalia, which was in February. Basically a week-long celebration. For the first part, it was quite related to just your own personal ancestors. You would go to their tombs, to their sarcophagi, visit them and give them offerings, perhaps have feasts, and particularly you would bring flowers. And there would be other periods where you would also bring flowers, perhaps on a birthday, or the Festival of Roses, or the Festival of Violets. So I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that in just a second. There's another set period for the Romans where they would interact with the deceased, and that was the Lemuria, and that was in May. And this is a really fascinating public regularized festival because essentially it was so superstitious. It was the time that you would drive out spirits and ghosts. Some of them are ancestral from your own household. It's on 3 different days that are not consecutive. And we're told that what would happen is the householder would get up at midnight and barefoot and walk through the house. You were supposed to throw black beans over your shoulder to propitiate the spirits. You bang together pots to chase them away, and then you say 9 times, "Be gone," as ancestral spirits. So it's really interesting that these are times to interact with the dead, essentially, that are set aside to us is an odd part of the calendar, and we don't know why they happen at this time of year, which is actually super interesting. But also in these periods, we're told no marriages should take place, no court cases should happen. These things are nephas. And just to briefly touch on Greek and Egyptian times for interaction with the dead. In the Greek world, there was the Genesia, which was in a month that basically corresponds to September, October in the Attic calendar. And this essentially is also when you would interact with your ancestors and make offerings. And certainly you would do it at other times of year. And then there's also an Egyptian festival of the beautiful Festival of the Valley, which was the 2nd month of harvest. So we're in a harvest period now. This was 2nd month of harvest, but it turns out in the Egyptian world, the harvest months were in the spring, basically April, May, essentially. So in this period, the people would go to their ancestors' tombs, have a feast with their dead ancestors, and again, also bring flowers. So maybe that's one of the reasons that they're set in the spring. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to give you a sense of what we know about this. So Ovid, who was a writer in the late 1st century BCE, early 1st century CE, one of his works was to write a very long poem describing the Roman events of the calendar. For whatever reason, he only got through the first 6 months. And this is his description of the end of Parentalia, where you go to the tombs. Tombs get tribute. You must appease your ancestral spirits. So they need something from you, but it doesn't have to be big. You can bring very small things like a bit of salt, some grain, some bread soaked in water, or in wine. Obviously, it should be soaked in wine. And then you need to make the right prayers. So there's this idea that to keep your spirits alive or to keep them happy, you need to make these offerings periodically. So that's what I have to say for now on that.
And it's interesting that even in across cultures, even the harvest is connected to these particular festivals, and certainly Halloween wasn't depicted at this time. That was not certainly the language that was used, but around festivals similar to what we now know as All Souls or All Hallows Eve or Dia de los Muertos or Halloween. Not to be conflated, right? These are very different types and styles of festivals that really do have a kind of genesis in what you're talking about, Lisa. So I figure we could switch gears. We're really not switching gears here, right? We're talking about how we mourn. But for you, Ellen, are there similarities between the Egyptian and Aztec culture in this respect of the harvest?
Yeah, to some extent there are. I think there's a lot of recognition as people have become more and more interested in Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, in the wake of the movie Coco and the other James Bond movie and various depictions of the Day of the Dead. I think there's become much more interest in it and kind of an awareness that this probably is a syncretic holiday, that this is a syncretic practice, because we know that for the Aztecs, they had in their calendar, they had 20 months, these 13 months of 20 days each. And there were 2 months around harvest time, which for them would have been late August, beginning of September, which were devoted to the dead. And it's sort of a time that's thought of as the whole land is to some degree in a dead, resting, very dormant phase, because there's no food really left, right? You're just waiting for those first green corn ears to be ready to be harvested to make new types of tamales, to make new types of food. So it's sort of the land is dead, and it's a good time to be commemorating your dead. So we know that the Aztecs would have celebrated at that time, but then it seems as though when the Spanish invade and there's this imposition of Catholic faith, that there's a moving of the festival that has to do with the dead and revering one's ancestors, moving that over to what was All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. So in the collection, we have a very interesting and unusual wood image of Mictlantecutli. There will be a quiz on this later about his name. Just kidding, there will not be a quiz. But his name means Lord of the Underworld, or Lord of the Realm of the Dead in the Nahuatl language. It was something made by peoples that we would call Aztec. They probably call themselves Mexica. And you'll notice that it's not exactly a mask in the sense that there's no holes in the eyes. So we don't know if this is something that's worn by a human impersonator of this deity, or more likely it's tied on to some kind of a wood or other kind of effigy to stand in for this Mictlantecutli, the Lord of the Dead. And in terms of time and practices about this, although there were sacrifices to Mictlantecutli, and the Aztecs or Mexica get this rap that their culture is all about death, there's a lot of really evocative and fascinating poetry that's much more wistful in character, that's much more poignant, a lot of it dealing with death and with this uncertainty that comes with death. So I won't read the whole poem, but this is a poem called Flowers Are Only Garments, attributed to the Mexica ruler Nezahualcóyotl. And in this, flowers were not actually worn as clothes necessarily, but it also gets at this idea of flowers as part of offerings around this time for the dead. But I just love these last few lines of this. The first part, dealing with flowers, is sort of about, let us all take the small pleasures that we can, seize the day, FOMO, enjoy the things that we can while we can. But then this very poignant last line, that we will not be friends forever, only for a moment here. Then we go to Life Giver's home, Awaya Awaya, which just sort of gets this at this mystery and wistfulness of the transitory nature of life. So I think that's there are some connections with both of the cultures that the other cultures we're talking about today.
Yes, and to your point, to your point, Ellen, I think there is a lot of conversation around today, but also just in thinking about mourning practices, about the afterlife and how the dead and the living commune with one another. You mentioned cocoa, for instance. Another thing I want to point out is that flowers are certainly an important and intrinsic part of some of the death practices that we're talking about, or how they are visualized in memoriam in some cases of Lisa's example. And so I'm curious for you, Jo, to bring you into the conversation. How in work that you see throughout your collection area tie the afterlife and how the dead and the living commune?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We don't have the same kind of burial or grave-related artifacts in the 18th and 19th century collection, things that were placed in tombs that we might see in Ellen or Lisa's collection. We do have a small collection of jewelry that was made to commemorate deceased loved ones, and a few depictions of widows, like this drawing by the French artist William Adolphe Bouguereau. And Bouguereau was an incredibly popular artist with American collectors in the second half of the 19th century. And you might be able to make out his signature here in the bottom right-hand corner. And this drawing shows two women kneeling at a grave. But if we go to the next slide, you can see that this is actually a drawing based on a painting that Bouguereau completed in 1859. And I think it's really striking when you see the painting. The major difference, of course, is color. And it makes a huge difference to the sort of emotion of the scene. But I'm going to talk about the wearing of black a little bit later. But the thing I wanted to focus on now is the fact that the color in this painting tells you what time of year it is. So you can see that the leaves on the trees and the leaves on the ground are kind of orangey brown color. So we can tell this is autumn or fall. So it's likely either All Saints or All Souls Day. And in fact, the title of the painting in French is Le Jour de Mourn, which translates as the Day of the Dead. So it's very clear what we're talking about here. What's interesting, flowers have come up a few times already. And you can see that these two women are holding wreaths, round wreaths made out of yellow flowers. And I think these are probably chrysanthemum flowers, what in America are called mums. In France, these flowers are actually very closely associated with death and with graves. I don't think that's the association here in America or in England. Certainly, judging by the flowers I see in window boxes around my neighborhood, I don't think that's the association that's being made. But it does call back to this idea of offering flowers to the dead that Lisa mentioned, even back in the Roman era. So in fact, All Saints and All Souls Days do call back to both the Roman festival of Pomona, but also the Celtic festival of Samhain. And these were both celebrated at the end of the harvest and anticipated the coming of winter. And this was seen as a kind of in-between time between the summer and the kind of dark of the winter time, when spirits could come back and commune with the living. And when the Christian church, headed by the Pope in Rome, was gaining power, leaders found that overwriting pre-Christian feast days with Christian saints' days was actually a way to kind of redirect people's attention. This was easier than just flat out repressing or abolishing a previously existing festival. So the Celtic Samhain was blended with Christian feasts to become All Saints and All Souls. At the Reformation in the 16th century, Martin Luther rejected the veneration of saints. So for his followers, known as Protestants, there was no place for All Saints or All Souls. And in Protestant countries today, you often find there aren't quite as strong Halloween traditions. In the United States, it was European Catholics who came to Virginia and also Maryland, where we are, who brought All Saints and All Souls Day traditions with them. And then in the 19th century, when a large number of Irish Catholic immigrants came to this country, those Celtic and Catholic elements were brought to America. And an interesting thing to note is when, at the time, it was the carving of turnips that was done at this time of the year. And because pumpkins were available in America and are frankly a lot easier to carve, although still pretty hard to carve, it actually became the kind of jack-o'-lantern that we're familiar with in America. And I certainly think that a pumpkin spice latte is more appetizing than a turnip spice latte. So it's probably a good job maybe that happened. But to talk about, if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about wearing black, because I think that's one of the things that really kind of sticks in popular culture about the Victorians and about Victorian widows in particular. And this relates to time, because the color that you wore marked the amount of time since your loved one had passed away. So in 19th century Europe and America, widows were expected to wear black. And depending on what source you read, that would last from anywhere from 2 to 2.5 years, or even longer, like Queen Victoria. So if you didn't have much money, you could dye your clothes black, but for the wealthy, there were a lot of other options. In the first stage of mourning, you would, if you could, wear a dull black, and that would be for a year and a day. And if you had the money, the black material of choice would be a fabric called crepe, which is actually a crinkled silk gauze with a matte finish. And the dress here on the left from the Metropolitan Museum is made of crepe. And you can see a detail in the center where I think you can make out that very crinkly surface that makes it extremely matte, kind of absorbs the light. And then the second stage of mourning, you were allowed to wear shinier fabrics, maybe a little bit of white, slightly more trimmings. And then a woman could move to purple or to gray. And at the right here is a bodice which combines purple and black, and this was called half mourning. And I wanted to end just by noting that men were not expected to follow these rules. This was really for women. And also men were allowed to remarry straight away, but a woman was supposed to wait for 3 years. So it's interesting how that kind of burden of death and remembrance was falling onto women, particularly in this century.
And what's so interesting on the subject of time is that women were expected to wait to remarry. There's like a very, just culturally speaking, how that would change your life to be unmarried if so chosen, to not be wanted to be unmarried, could kind of change their life. So I wanted to shift just a bit to place, our next theme. And I wanted to start with Lisa. Did or does location play a role in Greek and Roman and Egyptian mourning practices?
Absolutely. With the Egyptians, place had so many different little nuances to it. So that's one of the reasons I have these statues here. For your spirit to survive, you needed to preserve many different elements, including your body, your name, your shadow, your ka, which is sort of your life force, your ba, which is your soul, and was usually depicted as a human-headed bird, and then your ak, which is sort of your spiritual essence. And so essentially you would have your mummified preserved remains in your tomb, and then you would also have images of yourself, and your name would have to be on many of these images. It should be identifiable to your soul so that your soul can re-inhabit the images, or your ka or your ba can re-inhabit the images, whether it looks like you or not. So these two images on the screen are very interesting as a contrast, and also sort of another nod towards syncretism, where on the left we have Nehi from the New Kingdom. Nehi was a songstress of Hathor, and she actually had 2 statues. So there were multiple places where her ka spirit could go. And what I love about this one in particular is that along the length of her dress, and again, I should say this is a very idealized image of Nehi. We don't think this is exactly what she looked like, but this is how she probably dressed and wore her hair. But on her dress, it says the things that she needs for her ka to survive. So you bring her bread and beer, oxen and fowl, wine, incense, water, everything that's good and pure for the ka of the Osiris Nehi. So just to give a sense of the kinds of things that were meant to come to her as part of her mortuary cult. But also, of course, she would come at other times, particularly the beautiful festival of the valley, to have a meal with Nehi if she was one of your ancestors. And we can compare that with this mummy portrait of a devotee of Isis from the Roman period, where this is probably what this woman looked like. There's a certain idealized view of her face, but the way she wore her hair, there's so much individualism to her narrow features and pointed chin, and the way she dressed, wearing an Isis knot. We can really assume to a very much bigger degree that this is what she looked like in life. And so her ka-spirit, this is over 1,000 years later, would still go and seek her mummified body and be able to inhabit it. So these would have been in a tomb. Tombs would have had false doors for the spirit to go in and out of from the afterlife. The afterlife was sort of envisioned as below. And what is very interesting about it is that there's also this kind of east-west factor to it. So many of the necropolis or cities of the dead were set up on the west bank of the Nile. And there's part of the Valley Festival is to come from the eastern bank of the Nile to the western bank. And even in Egyptian literature, sometimes the deceased are referred to as Westerners. And in the Book of the Dead, often the deceased are referred to as Westerners in compared to Easterners, who are essentially the living. So there's this like really strong dichotomy between the two. And if we go to the next slide. So other tombs that you would visit. So I should say in the Egyptian world, the necropolis are definitely set aside from where people lived. In the Greek world, cemeteries are essentially set up next to where people lived. And this was a tradition also continued by the Romans. So essentially your cemetery should be just outside your city walls. And the most famous cemetery of Athens, the Kerameikos, was just outside a very prominent gate. But essentially, sometimes the city would come to envelop the cemetery, and that was considered okay. But what we can see here on the left are two views of a volute crater, and this is actually a culturally Greek vessel from Italy in the 4th century BCE. And on the far left, you see a tomb monument with either the deceased and a servant who are painted white. But what I actually think, since I looked at this more closely recently, I actually think that those are a statue representation in a tomb monument, which makes good sense. This is actually what we see with preserved tomb monuments. And floating around them are the spirits of the dead, but also a human woman bringing an offering with a crater coming to approach. And on the other side, so essentially in the middle, where you see our spirits around a stele with a vase on top. And this type of loot crater probably would have marked a stele like this. It would have been on top of something. And it's being wrapped with a ribbon. This was something that the Greeks would do. They would go bring offerings. They would wrap ribbons around the steles. I'm not entirely sure why. I haven't found anything spelling out why that was part of the ritual. And then on the right, what we have is a lekathos on white ground. And again, there's this element of spirits and the living. So on the far right, you can just barely make out the deceased man is standing wearing a red mantle. And he is there observing a woman who's bending over to wrap a fillet around his tomb monument. So it's this idea that you really have to propitiate the dead to keep them happy. They need these regular interactions. While we don't have a strong color for mourning in the ancient world that associated like we do with Victorians and black, or even today with black, there is a really strong association with these white ground lekathoi and death and burial. They typically turn up in burials. Much of my collection comes from burials, as Jo alluded to. But many of these vessels, oil vessels essentially, actually show visits to the grave. So there's this very strong association, but white wasn't necessarily the color of death the way it is for instance, East Asian cultures. And so these tombs were set up along, tombs and cemeteries were set up along roads leading in and out of the cities, as I said, near the gates. So literate people, as they're coming by, are also sort of activating the graves by reading the tombstones and remembering the dead. Often they'll say, passerby, remember me. And obviously the families are coming to make offerings. And then just one thing I'll say to sort of wrap it in with what Ellen was saying at the very beginning, there is a story that in the Spartan world, and this is somewhat apocryphal, it comes from the 2nd century CE instead of the 6th century BCE, but that Spartans in Greece would be commemorated with their names on tombs if they were men, if they died in battle, and if they were women, either if they died in childbirth or if they were priestesses. There's actually some argument about the Greek there. So it's very interesting the way how you died can influence how you are commemorated.
That's really interesting how color plays into it or not, in factoring into burial. And I'm curious from you, Ellen, is place, how is that a factor in your collection area?
Yeah, so it's we didn't get into this as much before, but in central Mexico, the central part of what is today Mexico, among the Mexica or Aztecs, to some degree, there's a pragmatic response. Many of them live right by the lakes, the shores of a series of lakes in central Mexico. So there's a lot more cremation than there is burial. There, to some degree, lower classes are buried often right under their house, and there's many other civilizations in Mesoamerica and in the Americas that definitely do bury and commemorate their dead. But especially if you were upper class in the Aztec world, you would probably be cremated and have your remains kept in an urn. But in terms of places, the sort of land of the dead, Mictlan was thought to lie to the north. We were talking in our rehearsal about how interesting it was, that this does get away from that east-west path of the sun, and renewal, the whole idea of the sun rising and renewal. But yes, so Mictlan, the place of the dead, is thought to be in the north, and the color associated with it actually was white, even though the underworld is often associated as well with black. So it's sort of both of those. Here we see the same figure that we have in the mask in the Walters collection, Mictlantecutli, the Lord of the Dead, back to back with another deity, Ehikatl, the god of wind. And this, I think, gets at this idea of life and death being sort of two sides of one coin, or being intricately intertwined with each other, because the story, one version of the myth about creation of humans holds that Quetzalcoatl or Ehikatl was allowed to gather the bones of dead previous races of man that had arisen before, and was taking them out of the land of the dead. And then the Lord of the Underworld sort of changes his mind halfway and causes this pit to be there, which the other god falls into, breaking all of the bones. And so he later is able to gather up the bones and take them back to the land of the living. But that explains why some of us are taller than others, because the bones had been broken. So I think that this really gets at this idea of life and death being really intertwined, which I think is very interesting.
It is very interesting about how we're intertwined with the dead. And in thinking about mourning practices in a completely different part of the world and time, in the 18th and 19th century, for you, Jo, how does place or feelings of space and place factor into your collection area, or is represented?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because this brings it right back to Baltimore. In around 1830, in North America, we start to see planned graveyards. So obviously there'd been graveyards before, but they were often in the middle of cities. And in this period, cities were growing, cemeteries were becoming very overcrowded, and even seen as causing disease. So there was a movement to build cemeteries outside of cities, and Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore is an example of this, and it was dedicated in 1839. It's laid out with curving paths and walkways, almost like a park, and it is protected with high walls and a Gothic-style gatehouse. Many wealthy Baltimore families like Hopkins or Pratt, whose names are still familiar here in Baltimore and even beyond, have their family plots in Greenmount. And so does the Waters family, who founded the Waters Art Museum. So here I'm showing you a photograph of the Waters family plot taken around 1880. And it was common that grave markers for the wealthy were incredibly elaborate. And as you can see here, it meant that the graveyard was really like an outdoor sculpture park. And the most visually striking thing about the Waters grave is this life-size bronze statue known as Love Reconciled with Death. And this is a draped female figure, and she has one arm outstretched, and she's scattering flowers onto the slab below. And those flowers are also made out of bronze, and you can probably just about make them out here. And again, this is another reference to flowers. The statue was modeled by an artist who was a good friend of the Waters family, and he was actually born in Union Bridge, Maryland, and he was called William Henry Reinhardt. And they installed the statue in 1867. The first Waters family member buried there, who lived into adulthood at least, is Ellen Waters, the wife of William Waters and the mother of Henry Waters, who founded the Waters Art Museum. Ellen died relatively young and also quite suddenly at the age of 40. And you can see that it's actually her profile that's in the round bronze plaque on the side of the statue's pedestal. And it's based on a marble bust of her, which you can see on the right, which was also by Reinhardt, and it was completed in the year that she died. So as I mentioned, in the 19th century, graveyards like Greenmount functioned as parks, green spaces, and retreats. And in the United States, cemeteries were and are still visited on Memorial Day each May, a tradition that began after the Civil War. So although people in the 19th century were far more connected to death due to higher mortality, especially for children, by making cemeteries a place removed from everyday life, this was kind of the beginning of death being placed at one remove from life. So with the establishment of hospitals, the growth of embalming as a profession, death was something that increasingly happened away from the home and even out of sight. But if we go to the next slide, you can see that even at the same time that this distancing was happening, there was a way that you could keep the memory of a dead loved one close by through jewelry, and specifically mourning jewelry, which was very common in the 19th century. This could range from something relatively affordable, like a black pin or a brooch made out of jet or glass, or it could be very elaborate, made out of enamel and pearls and hairwork even. So on the left here is a cameo brooch, which is made out of shell. And this was commissioned by William Waters after his wife's death. And it shows Ellen Waters in profile. And again, it's based on the Reinhardt bust and the bronze roundel that we saw on the grave. In some ways, however, this is not so conventional in terms of mourning jewelry. It's not black, there's no pearls. Much more typical is what's on the right here, and this is a mourning ring in the Waters collection. It was made in England in the early 19th century, and it includes the hair of two people, a brother and a sister, whose names and ages are inscribed around the band. And the enamel around those names is white because those two people were very young and they weren't married. So it sort of reflects, I guess, the idea that they were somehow pure at this point in their life. And hair was used because it doesn't decay. It's actually pretty durable. And so here it's woven into these panels, but hairwork could even be very elaborate. It could be worn in, as earrings or bracelets, or even full-scale wreaths were woven out of hair. And so both these pieces of jewelry were really supposed to keep a loved one close by, so that even though the deceased was physically distant in a graveyard outside the city, the souls were in a better place, but you could keep a tiny piece of them close to you to kind of keep that connection going.
Thank you for sharing. This is my time to remind those folks listening today and watching us to ask any questions in our comment section in our Facebook or over at YouTube. So go ahead and do that if you haven't already. I see that there is at least one question and a couple of comments already there. So for you, Lisa, you talked about the East and the West and how the East represents the living, the West represents the dead. And does that have anything to do with the rising and the setting of the sun, or is it coincidence?
No, it's absolutely related to that. And in many Egyptian tombs, there will be elaborate depictions that show the path of the sun to be reborn, essentially moving from west to east. And we also have that in a more esoteric form in our Book of the Fayum at the Walters, where it certainly goes from west to east, and then you're reborn again in the morning in the east.
And Ellen, what cardinal direction is important for the Aztecs? It seems like the north represented the dead for the Aztec, but were there other cardinal directions that were important?
Yeah, it's really interesting for Mesoamerican peoples of what is today the country of Mexico and much of Central America. They distinguished actually 5 cardinal directions. So there would be what we think of as north, south, east, and west, but also the center as a different direction. And each of these had associated colors, birds that were associated with them, trees that were associated with them. So they definitely distinguished these cardinal directions, and we're using them as a guide, but that there was a 5th, which is the center. I believe that's similar to Asian tradition as well.
That's so interesting to think about. I think that comes across in multiple cultures, like as you mentioned, but the center being a cardinal direction, I think is something interesting maybe for American audiences to think about. So this is a question for all of you, or a couple of questions for all of you. We mentioned that all of these cultures believed in an afterlife. We've mentioned that today. But how was that different from culture to culture? And I will leave this up for discussion as people are starting to ask questions in the comments. And then my second question is, was the afterlife the end, or was it the chance at rebirth? So actually, those are 2 very big questions. So I'll ask the first again. How was the afterlife different from culture to culture?
I will volunteer to not answer that question. I mean, what's too bad is that we couldn't have all of the curatorial staff here, because there's so many different views, especially within the continent of Asia. There's so many different views of the afterlife and rebirth. I mean, what I would say, the mystery cult of Dionysus certainly emphasizes the idea of rebirth, but I don't know if they actually meant that literally, or if it was rebirth into the afterlife. And then for the others, it's sort of like you can you're reborn into the afterlife, or you in Egyptian culture, I think you transform and you become a different form, but you only can live there as long as you get the things that you need. You only retain your form as long as people give you your offerings and remember you.
Yeah, within the Americas, there's definitely a wide range of traditions from, the idea of let's cremate and just hold on to the ashes, to the fact that there's so much natural mummification that goes on in the Andes. It's so dry, and you have this, but you do have a concerted effort to preserve the body and protect that, sometimes removing organs to some degree similar to the Egyptian case, but there's also just sort of natural mummification that happens to some degree. So there's a broad range of different ideas about what happens. It seems in some cases, the body is very important. In other cases, it's less important. I do think there's sort of conceptions of the afterlife in almost every culture. We are probably much more familiar with the ones for later cultures where there's testimonials of Spanish friars about what they understood, but sometimes it's not very clear. These are Spanish friars who are entrusted with not really allowing syncretism to happen, and trying to eradicate these practices. And so there are these tantalizing references to something that sounds almost like reincarnation, where one of the parts of your identity in Mesoamerica would be your heart your heart would go on. It's the Titanic. No, but that certain parts of you would go on, but it's really unclear exactly.
Yeah, all I was going to add to that is that the 19th century is also the century of the seance and the Ouija board, which was invented, I believe, here in Baltimore. At least the plaque in the 7-Eleven near where I live says that. And so even though I think there was this idea of a Christian sense, mainly of in the material I look at, of going to heaven, and quite how your identity is preserved after that, I'm not sure. But then there was this real interest in, talking directly to your dead loved ones at this time. So it seems like one can hold many conflicting views.
And I think that especially as cultures shift and change through time, not just through syncretism, or I think that we see that as well. Like we see those kind of different pockets come up, maybe some pulling from the past, but also some, I say modernism, because that certainly isn't what I mean, but something different or something conceptually new for that particular culture. I wanted to pull a question from the audience. We have Kathy Rumley. They ask, as a culture, or they make a statement and then they ask a question. As a culture, we North Americans seem to be overall afraid of death. Did ancient cultures have this fear? Great question.
I can start as the most ancient. I mean, for the Egyptians, there was certainly, well, I am the old, no. There was a fear that like you wouldn't pass the test. When you die, your heart is weighed. And if your heart was too heavy against the feather of Mot or Truce, then it would be eaten, it would be devoured, and you wouldn't get to go to the more pleasant field of reeds. So there was a certain fear there, but essentially there was the idea if you did everything right and you followed all the spells and you had everything set up and your family remembered you, then you would continue to have everything good. You would have all the same things. They would lay out like you're going to do every single thing, including copulating. They really had it all laid out, that you did in life, you'll do in death. And, the same for Greek and Roman. There was a sense like for really egregious cases, it might not go so well. Sisyphus pushing his boulder up the hill forever, Tantalus never being able to drink. But if things were good, you might go to a very nice place, the Isle of the Blessed or Elysium. So it was really positive, and like it's possible that you could go on forever. So it's very difficult for me to say because our populace is very diverse and has diverse beliefs. Why we're so afraid, but I think we don't have the same unified set of beliefs saying that it's all going to be great. Obviously. Certain groups do have beliefs in heaven versus hell, and and they're like, it's going to be great, it's going to be fine, don't worry about it. But the idea that life is short and eternity in heaven is long was very positive and really reinforcing like this is going to be okay.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think there's no culture where there's not some fear. I talked about people going to different places. Some of the people who were going to the best places were people who had, who were going to be sacrificed to a particular deity. Then they were going to be accompanying that deity. So that's, we think about sacrifice, it seems so scary. We do know that at least in the Aztec or Mexica world, there would be people who got to live for a whole year or some period of time as that god, be dressed in beautiful clothing, wear jewelry, live a terrific lifestyle as that deity. But then when the time came, they needed to be sacrificed. But we do have some testimonials that some people did freak out at the time. There's a particular deity, and I'm forgetting whether, I believe it's the sun god, the person who lived as that god for the whole year, had to then walk up the steps of the temple themselves, breaking these clay flutes that they played all around the city on their own, and then happily lie down for sacrifice. And so we have testimonials that there would be cases where people would get nervous at the end, and that was seen as very inauspicious. So obviously everybody has worries about death, but I think I agree with Lisa. If there's a unified belief system where everybody is affirming that it's going to be okay, that's probably very reassuring.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think generally speaking, the Victorians saw it as you were going to a better place, you would be at rest. Thinking about the kinds of words that are written on gravestones, they tend to be quite reassuring in the 19th century, which is a little bit of a change from previous centuries. And yeah, it's maybe something we've lost a little bit, but certainly for the Victorians, I think generally the thought was that you were better off.
It's so interesting how the same and different all of those cultures are. In some cases, it's both and, right, for both of those. We talked about it a little bit, but I'm curious, maybe this will be sort of a pop quiz thing, but our own Donnie Chan had a question, or what colors are associated with death and mourning in these cultures? You mentioned it a little bit, but I wanted to know if you could either rattle them off, or maybe there were some we didn't mention in our presentation today.
I'm happy to start again. Donnie really hit the nail on the head, because we had a theme on color that we didn't have time to really unpack. And so we all sort of alluded to it. And I would just say that for the cultures that I'm looking at, as diverse as they are, I don't know of any particular color associated with mourning, except for the white ground lekythoi, or the white ground pottery, like I was referencing.
Yeah, as I said, the color associated with the North is white, and there is certainly descriptions of, in funeral ceremonies, people would wear very plain white tunics amongst the Mexica, but then black and even gray and dirt is sort of associated with this, because if we were to really go into the mourning rituals, for the Mexica, I believe that there's this 80-day period of mourning, and you're actually not supposed to wash at any point during that. It's the most deep mourning. And then at the end of it, some sources say that dirt would actually be scraped off of you, put into special papers, and taken outside the city walls. So I think both black and white, or maybe gray and white.
Yeah, I think obviously it's quite strong and somewhat codified for the Victorians what colours were associated with death. I know that somewhat earlier in European history, it was for royal queens, they would often wear white to mourn, but in the 19th century, it really became black. And this was partly it was as much to do with the expanding textile industry, and after the 1860s, really the perfecting of black dyes that really helped to underpin this. So although it is something that's emotional and a societal norm, there is this kind of economic part to it as well.
I definitely think anytime in the 19th and 20th century, you have to include that, right? Because of the industry and kind of shift in industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there are whole shops in London devoted to mourning wear. And, there is a tension there that mourning wear could be very fashionable. It could be very elaborate. It was, if you were wealthy, it almost became a way to show off yet again how wealthy you were. So there's a tension there between kind of the sadness and then this, conspicuous consumption.
Very well put. This is my last question for the night, if we don't have any more from the audience. For you all, what role did the living have in ensuring a safe journey in the afterlife? Was there maybe you could pull out a particular interest or anecdote from your collection area in which the living had a very central role, or a semi-central role in the safe journey to the afterlife?
Well, I think like many cultures, the Aztecs or the Mexica had professional mourners, and I'm sure that's the case I know that's the case for many cultures. And so part of that was this lamentation was very important. And actually they would make 4 little effigies of the person, and then destroy those. And every year on the anniversary of the death, I believe, you would make another 4 effigies until this 4-year period of mourning had concluded. And it's kind of interesting because, in Mexican Catholic tradition as well, you say masses at certain intervals, and some of those seem to be corresponding to numbers that were important within pre-Columbian or ancient traditions as well.
And I would say, while it's hard to pull out a particular example, that what is very clear from just the little vignettes, and obviously I didn't cover everything, the vignettes I'm giving is that it was important for the living to maintain offerings and remembrances and to follow the instructions that were given for the spirits to continue to survive.
Yeah, I kind of wish our colleague Christine was here, because in the Middle Ages and medieval times, there was definitely the idea of having people pray for you, for several, maybe even forever after you've died. I think in the 19th century, it gets back to this idea in the Bouguereau picture of just going back every year and putting the flowers and showing that you're remembering and looking after the grave.
Well, that's true. And also something we talked about in rehearsal before was also cleaning of graves is an important manifestation of how you care for graves. So I know in Chinese culture, it's important to go clean the graves of your ancestors. And my husband's family does that. And I think somebody else was talking about how that's also important in certain other cultures today. So.
For sure, in Mexican culture today, that's a big part of Day of the Dead, is that if it's at all possible, you go and spend time in the cemetery and clean the grave, decorate it with flowers, etc.
Yeah, and I mentioned Memorial Day here. I certainly went to the graveyard on Memorial Day and saw people bringing flags to graves and flowers to graves. So it's not quite the same time of year as Halloween or Saints for Our Souls, but I guess there's a slightly more secular angle to that in America following the Civil War.
And I just want to mention from the comments, Christine says, "Hi, I'm here. Thank you for mentioning." We have a lot of other great curators here watching with us. I want to thank you all for being here, for our curators, and for spending so much time in thinking about mourning and our collection and how it's connected. And there's so many nuances. I think everybody's alluded to the fact that there's so many other topics we could be talking about. So that tells us that we will be doing in some form in the future programs around either mourning or practices, because there's so much detail that goes on across the timeline and across the world. I do feel like the audience today got a pretty rounded, I wouldn't say well-rounded, but rounded view of how we mourn across the collection and across the world. And there certainly are some more curators we can bring in for that conversation. I want to thank our audience for being here, for participating, for asking questions. We see your comments. Thank you so much. And we also want to thank our digital team. Without our digital team, this program does not happen. You do not see us. You do not hear us well. And so we want to thank them a great deal. And yeah, thank you everyone for being here, and have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful evening.
And we look forward to seeing you at more programs related to Day of the Dead over the next few days.
Yes, I should plug one more time before we head out. Go to thewalters.org and you can find we're the second banner there. So if you just scroll down just an inch or a half an inch, you will see us there, and you can find our community altar. You can find art activities for families. You can also find more live programming like this for adult and family audiences. So thank you so much for everyone, and have a wonderful night.